There were 9 women on that platform, and 8 of them were beautiful. I want you to understand what that meant in a valley where most men hadn't stood close enough to a clean-smelling woman in 3 years to remember it. 8 faces scrubbed and hopeful. 8 bonnets. 8 pairs of hands folded just so, the way the marriage agent must have taught them on the long ride west. Chin up, girls, let them see you're worth the fare. And then there was the 9th. She stood a half step behind the others, the way you stand when you've already been told without words that you're not part of the parade. Nobody looked at her twice. Not the ranchers in their good shirts. Not the widowers. Not the boys who'd saved 2 years' wages for a wife. Their eyes slid right off her and onto the pretty ones, the way water finds the low ground. The mountain man came down that morning. He almost never did. And when the agent said, "Gentlemen, step forward and make your choice," and the whole town leaned in to see which beauty that big silent creature would claim. He walked past every one of them. He walked past the 8 and he stopped in front of the 9th, the one nobody wanted, the one they'd already left behind. I was standing close enough to hear what he said to her, and I'm going to tell you the whole of it because I've carried this story near 40 years now, and I'm old, and a thing like this shouldn't die with the last man who saw it. But first you need to know why they left her behind, because it wasn't her face. It was her blood. The morning the brides came up the mountain, I broke an axle a mile below Cedar Hollow and cussed at God for the better part of an hour. Name's Gideon Price. Was anyway. Back then I drove freight and passengers on the worst road in the territory, a switchback goat track the maps didn't bother nomming that climbed from the flats up to the mining camps around Cedar Hollow and Providence, and a scatter of ranches that had no business existing so high. I kept a ledger for every run. Still do, though there's nobody left to bill. Habit's a strange thing. I write down the weather and the load and who rode with me, and 40 years on I can open a book and smell the day. The entry for that morning says, 9 head marriageable, Agent Coombs, broke axle, Coombs prayed, women did not. I remember the women didn't pray because I remember thinking it was odd. 8 of them sat there in the stalled coach in their traveling dresses, quiet and stiff as churchgoers, hands in their laps, and not one of them so much as whispered a Lord's name help us when the wheel went and the whole box lurched sideways over a drop that would have fed us all to the rocks. They just held on, held their breath, held their hope like a coin they were afraid of dropping. The 9th one got out and helped me with the axle. Didn't ask, didn't announce it. She climbed down in that plain gray dress, walked around back, saw me sweating under the coach and put her shoulder to the thing without a word so I could get the block set. She had strong hands, working hands scarred across the knuckles. When it was done she stepped back, wiped them on her skirt and went and stood a little apart from the others, like she'd remembered something and it made her tired. "Obliged," I said. She looked at me. Dark eyes, steady, older than the rest of her. She couldn't have been more than 25, but the eyes had a long road in them. "You're welcome," she said, and that was all. Agent Coombs came around then, mopping his neck. He was a soft, damp man who sold women the way other men sold mules, and he had opinions about his stock. He caught her by the elbow and steered her back toward the group like she'd wandered off from the herd. "Teodora," he said low, but I heard it. "Stand with them. You paid the fare, you stand in the line. But don't go pushing yourself forward when we get up top, you hear. You'll only embarrass yourself." He said it kind, the way a man is kind when the cruelty's already so deep he can't feel it anymore. Some of these men, they got particular feelings about your sort. No sense courting grief. Her sort. I'd been driving that road 11 years. I'd hauled up whiskey drummers and consumptives, and a preacher who turned out to be wanted in 2 states. I'd learned to mind my business the way you learn to mind a mean horse, for your own sake. But something in the way he said your sort stuck a splinter in me, and I looked at her proper for the first time. She was Apache, or half. I'd learned later it was her mother's people, Chiricahua, and her father, a Mexican wheelwright out of Tucson, who'd married the woman he loved and buried her young. and then followed her into the ground before Teodora was grown. She had the high bones and the copper in her skin, and the black hair she'd pinned back severe under a bonnet that wasn't fooling anybody who cared to look. In a territory that had spent 20 years at open war with the Apache, where men in that very valley had lost brothers, sons, wives to raids, and where the newspapers ran the word savage the way they ran the weather. She was walking into a marriage market wearing her mother's whole history on her face. And she knew it. That was the thing that got me, riding the last mile up after we'd fixed the wheel. She knew exactly what she was walking into. She'd known it the whole way from Tucson. She'd paid Coombs his fare and climbed into that coach with 8 prettier, safer, whiter women, knowing full well she'd be the last one standing on that platform if she wasn't run off at first. I didn't understand why a person would do that to themselves. I understand it now, but I didn't then. Cedar Hollow wasn't a town so much as an argument between a saloon, a general store, an assay office, and a church that shared its roof with the schoolhouse. But the marriage agent had sent word ahead by 3 weeks, and word like that travels, so by the time I hauled that coach up the last grade there were near 60 men gathered in the churchyard, and they'd all put on whatever they owned that was clean. You could smell the barbering. That's a detail I've never forgotten. 60 rough men who lived on beans and hard work in each other's company, and the whole yard smelled of bay rum and boot black and hope, and under it the sour tang of nervousness. Some of them had brought flowers. Mountain flowers, columbine and paintbrush, held in fists too big for them, wilting in the heat. They'd been lonely a long time, is what I'm saying. Don't judge them too hard yet. I'm going to tell you things they did that day that'll make your jaw tighten, but understand they were men who'd been starved of tenderness so long they'd half forgotten what it looked like, and starvation makes people ugly before it makes them anything else. Coombs lined the women up on the church steps like goods on a shelf. Read out their names, their ages, their particulars, the way you'd read a stock list. Miss Eliza Hartwell, 19, of Ohio, fine seamstress. Miss Caroline Beach, 22, widow, keeps a garden. And the men pressed in, and you could see it happen. You could see each woman get looked at, weighed, wanted, and you could see what it did to them. Some of them stood taller under it. Some flinched. One girl, the youngest, started crying and couldn't stop, and a big rancher near the front went soft in the face and said, gentle as anything, now, miss, no call for that. And I thought, well, maybe she'll be all right, that one. He read Teodora's name last. Read it flat and fast, the way you skip a line you're ashamed of. Miss Teodora Vega, 4 and 20. And then he didn't say fine seamstress or keeps a garden. He just moved his eyes away from her and said, now, gentlemen, the terms. And a voice from the crowd said, what is she? You know how a room goes when a knife comes out. It went like that. Quiet, but the wrong kind of quiet, the kind with an edge in it. What is she? The man said again. He was a lean, sunburnt fellow with a jaw like a shovel, and I found out later he'd lost a wife to a raid down near the Gila 6 years gone and had never once let it heal. She's a pash. Look at her. You brought a pash up here to stand with white women. Miss Vega, Coombs said, sweating, is of mixed. Her father was a respectable Christian man of Sonora. I don't care what her father was. The man spat. I buried Martha in a box we had to build small on account of what they left of her, and you want me to stand in a yard with? Then don't pick her, somebody else said, reasonable, and there was a laugh, an ugly, relieved laugh, the kind men used to let the pressure off. Ain't nobody making you pick her, Harlan. Ain't nobody gonna pick her. Let her stand there. Won't hurt nothing. And that settled it. That was the mercy they landed on. Let her stand there. Nobody's going to pick her anyway. And the choosing went on around her like she was a fence post, like she was weather, and she stood on that step with her chin level and her eyes fixed on the middle distance and took it. Took all of it. I watched a woman get made invisible in front of 60 people, and the terrible thing, the thing I'm ashamed of to this day, is that I let it happen too. I stood by my coach with my hat in my hands and I didn't say one word. I keep a ledger. I write down what happens. I don't always do more than that, It's a coward's habit, and I've made my peace with it mostly. The choosing took most of an hour. The men had drawn lots ahead of time for the order. It had been organized, if you can believe it, votes and everything. And one by one they stepped up and made their offers, and the women said yes or once or twice no. And by the time the sun was high there were 8 couples standing awkward and blushing in the churchyard, and one woman alone on the steps, and a scatter of disappointed men who'd drawn poor lots and gotten there too late. And that's when the mountain came down. I'd better tell you about Amos Rourke now, because you're going to need to understand him, and there's not much to work with. There wasn't much even then. He was the sort of man a place makes up stories about because he won't tell his own. He trapped and hunted the high country above Providence, north and west of the Hollow, up where the timber gives out and the world turns to rock and wind. Came down maybe 4 times a year to trade pelts for powder and coffee and salt, and the rest of the time he was just a rumor. Big, I mean big, the kind of big that makes a doorway look like a mistake. Beard down his chest, gone gray early. Nobody knew his age. Some said he'd been a soldier. Some said he'd killed a man in the States and run. Some said he'd had a wife and child once, up on the mountain, and something had happened to them in a winter. And that was why he'd gone strange and solitary, and why he never spoke unless the words were forced out of him one at a time like splinters. I only knew 2 true things about him. The first was that he paid his debts to the penny and never haggled. The second I'll get to, because it's the whole hinge of this story. He came into the churchyard on foot, leading a mule, because Amos Rourke didn't own a horse that could carry him. He hadn't shaved. He hadn't bay-rummed. He was wearing the same greasy buckskins he wore to gut a deer, and he smelled of wood smoke and hide and the cold, clean top of the world, and he walked into that yard of scrubbed and hopeful men like a boulder walks into a china shop. The talk died. People stepped back from him the way you step back from a bear that's wandered into the wrong meadow, not out of hate, just out of the animal sense that here was something you didn't have rules for. Coombs recovered first because Coombs always smelled a sale. Sir, you're late, I'm afraid. The ladies are largely spoken for, but if you've come to. Amos wasn't listening to him. He was looking at the church steps. He was looking at Teodora. And here's a thing I've turned over 10,000 times since. He didn't look at the 8 beautiful women. Not out of nobility. I don't want to paint him a saint. He wasn't. He just genuinely did not see them. His eyes went across that yard and landed on the one woman standing alone, and they stopped, the way your eyes stop on a fire in the dark. And I swear to you something moved in that great stone face that I don't have a good word for. Recognition, maybe. Like he'd found a thing he'd lost so long ago, he'd stopped nomming it. He crossed the yard. The crowd opened for him. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and took off his hat. That was the part that got everybody, that this half-wild creature took off his hat, and he stood there holding it in both hands like the flower holders had, and he looked up at her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice came out rusted like a hinge that hadn't turned in years. "My name's Amos Rourke. I got a cabin up past Providence. It's warm and it's tight and there's water and I don't drink." He stopped, started again, and you could hear how hard the words were for him, could hear him hauling them up from someplace deep and disused. "I ain't much to look at, and I know it. I ain't got away with talk. But if you'll have me, I'll be good to you every day I'm above the ground, and that's the truth, and I don't say things that ain't." The whole yard was silent. 60 people. You could hear the wind in the pines and the mule chewing. Teodora looked down at him. And I was close. I told you I was close, so I saw what most of them missed. I saw that she was afraid. Not of him. Of hope. Of being handed the one thing she'd told herself for years she'd never get, and not being able to trust it, because a woman who's been left behind her whole life learns that when something good walks toward her, it's usually walking toward someone behind her, and she'd better not be standing in the way when it passes. "Why?" she said. "Just that, why?" And Harlan, the sunburnt man, the one who'd buried his Martha in a small box, he laughed. Loud and cruel to cover something breaking in him, I think, though I didn't have charity enough to think so at the time. "Why?" he mimicked. "Because he's a mad old savage lover, that's why, girl. Because he's been up that mountain so long, the only thing'll have him is the only thing nobody else'll take. It's not a choosing. It's two throwaways finding each other. Ought to be poetic if it weren't so. Amos turned his head and looked at him. That's all, he just looked at him, and Harlan stopped. Whatever was in that look shut Harlan's mouth like a hand. Then Amos turned back to Teodora, and he answered her question. And this is the part I've never told anybody in 40 years, because it wasn't mine to tell, and both of them are long in the ground now, and I'm the only one left who heard it. So I'll tell it to you, and then it'll be yours to carry. Because, Amos said, I had a wife once. She was Mescalero, and a white woman came to our cabin one winter, lost off the trail, and my Nate took her in and fed her and kept her alive till spring. His hands were working the hat brim. And when the men came looking for that white woman, come summer, they found her safe and fat and happy, and they thanked us. And then they came back in the fall when I was away, and they killed my wife and my boy, because they decided a savage woman and a half-savage child weren't fit to breathe the same air as the woman they'd saved. He said it flat. No heat. Just fact, the way a man tells you a thing he decided long ago never to feel again because feeling it would kill him. So I know what you are, ma'am. You asked what you are, like it was a shameful thing. You're the woman they leave standing on the steps. And I'm the man that mountain didn't want either. And I have been alone up there 14 years, and I have decided I would rather be lonely with somebody than lonely by myself, if she'll have me. And I'll never once make you feel like the leftover thing, because I know exactly how that feels, and it's the worst thing there is. I have driven freight and cattle and coffins across this territory for the better part of a lifetime. I have heard men swear love in every fashion there is, drunk, dying on their knees at the point of a gun. I have never in my life heard anything like that, and I never will. Teodora Vega stood on those steps, and her chin, which had been level as a rifle sight through an hour of being made invisible, finally came down, and her face broke. Not into weeping, she was too proud for the crowd to see her weep, but into something rower than weeping, a kind of stunned unclenching, like a fist that's been closed so long it's forgotten how to open, and it hurts too. She opened her mouth to answer him. And that's when the shot came. I'd love to tell you it was over. It wasn't. Nothing that day was simple, and the hardest of it was still to come. The shot came from up the ridge, above the town, and it kicked splinters off the church post a foot from Amos Rourke's head. And for one frozen breath 60 people stood stupid in the yard, trying to understand a sound they knew too well to be hearing on a marriage day. Then somebody screamed, "Raid!" Screamed it the way you scream a thing you've been braced your whole life to scream, and the churchyard came apart. Men grabbed women. Men grabbed guns. Somebody knocked over the table of church coffee and it went everywhere, and I remember that, the smell of spilled coffee and gunpowder, because grief and terror always come to me smelling of small, ordinary things. But I was looking at the ridge, because I'd driven that country 11 years and I knew it, and I saw the riders come over the top, and I felt the bottom drop out of the whole day. Because they weren't Apache. They were white men, 6 of them coming down hard, and the man in front had a jaw like a shovel. No, wait, Harlan was still in the yard, I could see him. But the man in front was cut from the same cloth, and I understood, the way you understand a thing all at once and too late, that there was a whole faction in this valley who'd heard 3 weeks ago that the marriage agent was fool enough to bring an Apache woman up their mountain, and who decided, in the way small vicious men decide things, that they would not stand for it, that they'd waited, that they'd watch from the ridge to see which of them would be shamed enough to take her. And when they saw a man actually want her, actually take off his hat to her, actually speak to her like she was a soul and not a stain, that was the thing they couldn't bear. They hadn't come to raid the town. They'd come for the wedding. Amos Rourke put Teodora behind him. That's the last clear thing I saw before it all went to smoke and shouting. That great slow man moving faster than anything his size had a right to, putting his own body between her and the ridge, and reaching for the old rifle slung across the mule, And I heard him say to her, quiet, under all the screaming, in a voice that had gone from rusted to something terribly calm. Get in the church, Teodora, whatever you hear, you get in the church and you don't come out. And she looked at him, and she didn't move. And I realized she wasn't going to. She didn't get in the church. I want to start there in the second before everything, because for 40 years the picture that comes to me first is not the guns and it's not the blood. It's Teodora Vega standing her ground in the churchyard with 6 armed men coming down the ridge, and Amos Rourke telling her to run, and her not running. I've been running my whole life, she said. I was close enough to hear it under the noise. I'm done. And she bent down, calm as a woman picking up a dropped spoon, and she took the pistol out of the boot top of a man who'd been knocked flat in the scramble, and she checked the loads with hands that did not shake. And Amos Rourke looked at her for 1/2 of 1 second with an expression I can only call wonder, and then there was no more time for looking at anything. Let me slow it down, because it happened fast, and the fast version isn't the true one. The true one is in the small things. The riders came into the yard, and it should have been a slaughter. 6 mounted men with rifles against a scattered crowd of ranchers, half of them holding wilted flowers instead of weapons. It should have been the worst thing I ever saw, and I've seen some things. It wasn't, and here's why. Here's the thing about that valley I'd gotten wrong, and that the 6 men on the ridge had gotten wrong worse. They'd figured everybody hated the Apache woman. And a lot of them did. You saw that in the choosing, you saw it in Harlan. You can't tell this story honest and pretend the hate wasn't real and wide. But there's a difference between a man who won't marry a woman on account of her blood and a man who will sit his horse and shoot her at her own wedding. And when the riders came down shooting, that difference stood up in the churchyard and became the whole story. Harlan, the man who'd buried Martha, the man who'd said, "What is she?" The man who'd wanted her gone worse than anybody. Harlan was the first one to shoot back. I saw it. I couldn't believe it, and I saw it. He dragged a rifle off a wagon seat and he put himself sideways to the riders and he started working the lever. And when the boy next to him said, "Harlan, it's just the Pash girl they're after, let 'em," Harlan turned and hit that boy across the mouth with the rifle stock hard enough to sit him down, and roared in a voice I felt in my chest, "Not at a wedding. Not in my church. Not while I'm standing." I have thought about that man every day of my life since. I have never worked him out. I don't think a person is one thing. I think Harlan hated Teodora Vega with everything he had, and I think when it came to it he would have died before he let those men murder her in front of God, and I think both of those were true in the same body at the same time. And if you can explain that to me, I'll thank you, because I've had 40 years and I can't. It was over in maybe 2 minutes. It felt like a winter. The riders hadn't counted on the yard fighting back, and men who live rough don't stay surprised long. 3 of the 6 went down off their horses. 1 ran. 2 threw up their hands. And in the middle of it, in the smoke and the screaming and the horses turning circles, I lost sight of Amos and Teodora, and when the smoke thinned I found them and my heart went into my mouth, because Amos Rourke was on his knees. He'd been hit, high in the shoulder and again low in the side, and the buckskin was going dark and wet and spreading, and he was on his knees in the dirt with his rifle fallen and his big hands pressed to himself, swaying like a felled tree deciding which way to go. And Teodora was already there. She'd thrown the pistol down. She had both hands on him, on the wound, pressing, and she was talking to him low and fast in 2 languages, sliding between Spanish and Apache and English without seeming to notice she was doing it. And her face, the face that had stayed level through an hour of contempt, the face that hadn't wept even when he offered her a home, her face was wide open now and terrified and alive. "No," she was saying. No, you don't get to. You do not get to walk across a whole yard and say a thing like that to me and then die. You don't get to give me the one stay, look at me. You keep your eyes on me, Amos Rourke, you keep them right here." He got them on her. It took everything he had and he got his eyes on her face, and something in him steadied. the way a man steadies on a fixed point in a storm. "Told you," he said, blood in it. "Told you to get in the church. I don't take orders from a dead man, and you're not going to be one, so shut up and breathe." She had strips off her own dress already, gray cotton, packing the wound, and she worked like someone who'd done it before, and I found out later she'd tended her mother's people through more than one bad season. She knew wounds the way the doctor in Providence didn't, and she wadded and bound and pressed, and she never stopped talking because I think she knew, the way you know these things, that her voice was the rope he was holding. I did the one useful thing I did all day. I ran the coach team hard down that murderous road with Amos Rourke laid out in the box and Teodora holding him, and I got them to the doctor in Providence before the light went, and I have never prayed before or since the way I prayed on that grade, cursing and praying in the same breath, which I've always figured is the only honest way a man does either one. He lived. I'll tell you that now so you don't carry the dread through the rest of it the way I carried it that night. He lived, but it was close, and it was long. The low wound had torn up things inside him that don't knit clean, and he was 3 weeks on the doctor's cot between the living and the dead, and Teodora Vega did not leave his side for 1 hour of it. That's a plain sentence, and I want you to sit in it. She had known this man for the length of one conversation. He had taken off his hat to her and offered her a life and been shot before she could even answer him. She never did answer him, you understand. The yes got shot out of the air before she could say it, and she could have walked away clean. Nobody would have faulted her. She had no bond to him, no vow, nothing but 2 minutes in a churchyard and a lifetime of learning that good things don't stay. She stayed anyway. She sat by that cot 3 weeks and changed his dressings and cooled his fever and fed him broth a spoon at a time when he couldn't lift his head, and when he raved, deep in the fever, about the winter and the cabin and Nate and the boy. She held his hand and told him it was all right, it was long ago. He wasn't there anymore. He was here, and she was here. And the valley watched. This is the part I most want you to hear, because it's the part the world usually gets wrong when it tells stories like this. The world likes to pretend that a brave act fixes a broken place all at once, that the hate breaks like a fever and the sun comes out. It doesn't. It didn't. There were men in that valley who never came around, who moved off rather than live near her, who muttered till the day they died. Hate that old doesn't die because you shame it once. That's not how the human animal is built. But something shifted, small, real. It shifted the way ground shifts, slow, and then you notice one day the whole hills moved. It started with the food. Somebody left a covered dish on the doctor's step the first week, no note. Then somebody left a second. Then Caroline Beach, the young widow who kept a garden, one of the 8 who'd been chosen, came by with a basket and sat with Teodora an afternoon, and the 2 of them talked low over the sleeping man, and after that Caroline came most days. Then the doctor stopped charging. Then, and this is the one that broke me when I heard it, Harlan sent up a load of firewood for the cabin at Providence, cut and split and stacked, with word that a man laid up couldn't be expected to cut his own wood before winter, and that it wasn't for her, it was for Rourke, and anybody said different could take it up with him. It wasn't for her, he had to say that. He couldn't give the gift clean, but he gave it. People aren't one thing. I keep coming back to that. I've filled a lot of ledgers, and it's the only conclusion I ever reached that I'd stake my life on. People aren't one thing. I need to tell you about the hardest choice, because you asked me to tell it true, and there was a choice in it that I've seen break stronger threads than these 2. When Amos was mending, sitting up, taking food, ornery with boredom the way big strong men get when a body they've never had to think about betrays them, a rider came up from the south. From the Chiricahua Reservation down at San Carlos, which was a hard, poor, bitter place in those years, a place the government had penned people into like stock and half-starved. The rider was an old man, and he was Teodora's uncle, her mother's brother. He'd heard, the way word travels through country that the maps don't name, that his sister's daughter was up in the mountains, and he'd come to bring her home. Not home like a cabin, home like her people, Home like the only place in this whole wide stolen country where she'd be her sort and not a stain, where nobody would ever again make her stand alone on a step. He told her in their language, with Amos lying right there not understanding a word, that she didn't have to stay in a white man's valley being tolerated, that she had blood, that she had a place, that she could come down off this mountain and be among her own and be whole. And I watched Teodora Vega have to choose. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the shape of it, and Amos understood more than he let on, I think, because he'd married Mescalero and he knew what he was hearing, and he did the thing that near killed me. He didn't fight for her. He didn't beg. He looked at the old man, and then he looked at Teodora, and he said, quiet. He's right, you should go with him. She turned on him. What? You've got people. His voice was rough with more than the wounds. You've got a place they can't take from you. Down there you're not the leftover thing. Up here you'll always be fighting for the right to breathe. I told you I'd never make you feel like the thing nobody wanted. He had to stop. Big men aren't made for this, and it cost him. So I'm telling you to go where you're wanted for what you are, not took in despite it. That's the only decent thing I got left to give you. Go on. Go home. And there it was. The heaviest thing in the whole story, heavier than the guns. He loved her enough to send her away from him. He'd been alone 14 years, and he'd finally found the one person on the earth who understood his particular loneliness, and he was handing her back to her people because he decided her wholeness mattered more than his own heart. I've never seen a braver thing. Not the churchyard. This. Teodora stood between the two men, the old uncle who offered her belonging, and the mountain man who offered her love and was too honorable to keep her, and the whole rest of her life balanced on what she said next. She was quiet a long time. Then she said, and she said it in English, so Amos would understand every word, which was its own kind of answer before she'd even given it. She said, "My mother married a man from a different world. Her family told her she was throwing herself away, that she'd always be caught between, belonging nowhere, wanted nowhere all the way." She looked at her uncle when she said it, gentle, but she said it. And she used to tell me before she died that they were wrong, that she didn't belong nowhere. She belonged to the one man who saw her whole, that was a place, that a person could be a place. Her voice was steady, but her eyes weren't. I spent my whole life thinking she'd lied to me to feel better about a mistake, because I never once got seen whole. Not once. I stood on 100 steps and got looked past. She turned to Amos. And then a man walked across a yard past 8 beautiful women and stopped in front of the one nobody wanted, and told me he knew exactly what I was, and wanted me anyway, wanted me because he knew, not despite it, and got shot for it before I could answer him. Her jaw was working. You asked me why would you want me? I never answered. So here's my answer, 3 weeks late. You want me because you're the only person alive who ever saw the whole of me and didn't flinch. And that's not a small thing I'd trade for belonging. That is belonging. My mother was right. A person can be a place. She was crying now, finally, openly, and not ashamed. You're my place, Amos Rourke. You don't get to send me off it. You already tried once in that yard, and I didn't run then either. The old uncle watched her, and whatever he saw in her face, he was wise enough or loving enough to accept it. He didn't argue. He stayed 2 days, and he and Amos found a way to talk without much language between them, the way men who have loved the same kind of woman can. And when he left, he put his hands on Teodora's face and said something to her that made her weep. And then he rode back down to San Carlos and his hard-penned life, and I don't know that she ever saw him again. That's a grief that runs under the whole rest of it, quiet, the way the real griefs do. Choosing one belonging meant losing another. It always does. Nobody tells you that part. They were married that fall, in the church at Cedar Hollow, by the same steps. It wasn't a big wedding. Caroline Beach stood up with her. Harlan came, stood at the back, arms crossed, scowling, and left before the end, but he came, and he'd left another load of split wood at the cabin that was, again, officially not for her. The doctor came. I came, and I wore the one good coat I owned, and I cried like a fool, and I've never been ashamed of it. Amos still moved careful from the low wound and always would. He stood at those steps, the steps where she'd been made invisible in front of the whole valley. And this time the whole valley, or the part of it worth counting, stood there to see her chosen out loud in daylight, with her name said proud instead of skipped. They went up the mountain together after, past Providence up where the timber gives out to the warm, tight cabin he'd promised her. I hauled the last of their goods up that road myself and wouldn't take a cent for it, and when I set the last box down inside the cabin door, Teodora Vega Teodora Rourke now put her scarred working hand on my arm and said, "Thank you, Mr. Price, for the axle and the road, and for not looking away that first day." And I said she was welcome, though I'd looked away plenty that first day, and we both knew it, and she let me keep the lie because that was the kind of woman she was. I drove that road 11 more years before my knees gave out. I saw them off and on. I'd bring their supplies up in the fall, and there'd be smoke from the chimney and their 2 horses, and in time, a small one running out to meet the coach. A dark-eyed boy who had his father's size coming on him and his mother's steady look, and who called me Uncle Gede, and rode the last mile up on the box beside me every single time, no matter the weather, and asked me 1,000 questions about the world down below that I mostly couldn't answer. They had hard years. Don't think they didn't. The mountain's a hard place, and the world came up it now and again to remind them what it thought of them, and there were winters I'm sure near broke them, and losses I never heard the whole of. Love isn't a door you walk through into an easy room. It's a fire you keep. It goes out if you stop tending it, and it burns you sometimes while you tend it, and theirs got tended by 2 people who'd each spent a lifetime being cold, and knew exactly what the fire was worth. The last time I drove up, Amos was gray all through and slow, and Teodora's black hair had white in it, and they sat on the porch of that cabin in the evening with the whole blue world falling away below them, close together, not saying much, the boy grown tall and off somewhere on the ridge, and I thought, there they are, the 2 the mountain didn't want, the one they left behind, and the man who came down to find her, sitting up at the top of everything like they owned the sky. I got old. I stopped driving. I lost track of them the way you lose track of everything if you live long enough. I heard, years on, that Amos passed in his sleep in the deep of a winter, and that Teodora buried him herself up on that mountain, in ground he'd picked, and wouldn't let anybody help. I heard she stayed up there after. Alone, the way he'd been alone before she found him. But not the same. Not the same at all. Because there's a loneliness that's an empty room, and there's a loneliness that's a room somebody warm has lived in, and they are not the same thing, and I'd give a great deal to be able to tell her that I finally understand the difference. I'm the last one who saw it. The choosing, the churchyard, the yard full of smoke, the woman who wouldn't run. So now you've got it too. And if you ever find yourself standing in a crowd, watching the beautiful one step forward, and your eye catches on the one left behind, the one everybody's already looked past, the one who's learned to make herself invisible so the passing over won't hurt so bad,